Nobody's perfect, and I say that with full conviction. I know that nobody's perfect, but in the greenhouse industry, growers are constantly striving for perfection. And maybe a better way of saying that is striving for standards, a certain standard that is to be met. But in the greenhouse industry, growers that are professional are perfectionists in a way. We are striving for consistency at all times. If you step into any growing operation, you are going to see standards everywhere. You're going to see trays and materials, media and seeds that are meeting a certain standard. You are going to see labor and staff that are working through processes that need to meet a certain standard. You're going to see sanitization to make sure your materials are clean and meeting a standard. And all this to say that consistency is king in the world of greenhouse production. And let me give you an example of why that is. This is a 288 standard plug tray, and we have seen this before in a previous session, and this is what I do my production in. This is what is very common to see in the commercial industry. And this tray has, it's pretty darn near perfect. It's got the same volume, all the cells, for a reason. When you fill the tray with soil, let's say that you make a mistake and you fill part of the tray level with soil, and the other part of the tray is partially filled with soil. It's not filled all the way to the top. Now, you might think that's nitpicking to make sure that the tray is filled level to the top in every single cell. But let me tell you what happens when you don't fill a tray level in every single cell. This side is full, right? You go ahead and seed the whole tray. You've got the same species of seed, the same variety, and you seed the whole tray, you water it in, you do everything else perfect. Let's just say for this example, you do everything else perfect. The only thing you do is you inconsistently fill the tray with media. Well, when these seeds germinate 100%, because we are living in a perfect world except for that inconsistency, you are going to have some seeds that are growing in more soil and some seeds that are growing in less soil. And when you have more soil for a seed, it's going to retain more moisture. It's going to store up more moisture in more soil. And vice versa, when you have less soil in a given cell, less media, I should be using that term, you are going to have less water retention. So the cells that are partially filled are going to dry out more quickly than the cells that have full cells of media. So why does that make a difference? Well, the seedlings that are growing in the full cells are going to never quite dry out if you're trying to keep this side of the tray hydrated. You're going to have faster dry down cycles, which means that the tray on this side will dry out while this side stays wet. Why does that matter? Well, it's going to cause different types of growth in your seedlings. So the seedlings that are constantly wet, they might even have some algae or fungus gnats in the soil because it's never drying out well enough. They're going to have softer tissue, they're going to be leggy, they're not going to be quality at all. Then on this side, you're going to have seedlings that are shorter, they're maybe a little dull. You maybe even have some die down of some seedlings, some death because they dried out just too much and they passed the permanent wilting point, or the point at which there is no return for the seedling to pop back up and be happy. So automatically right there, you have a tray that just because you had one inconsistency when you were filling it with media, that one inconsistency can snowball and cause a problem down the road. So that example can show you why greenhouse growers are such nuts about having standards in everything we do. And as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this because I'm a little bit of a monster when it comes to perfecting the process. But for you, that's good, because today in this session, we're going to take a look at how you as a home gardener can work on perfecting the process and making your seedlings, your end results, more consistent and, in the end, higher quality. So without further ado, let's dive in. First things first, before you get started, you need to label. You need to have labels ready to go. And I mean, this is not something you do after you're done. This is something you have ready to go when you come out, wherever you're seeding, when you're outside or inside, wherever you are, you have your labels ready to go, because I guarantee it, if you seed a tray, you are going to mix up what varieties where. And especially when it comes to tomatoes and peppers, it's important to know what you got. You don't want to be mixing up your jalapenos with your bell peppers. Especially for me, my customers would be very angry. Labels are important. So I always include the plant name, but then I also include the week number. You might include the date. It's not super necessary, especially since you have your handy dandy schedule and you're tracking everything, but at least have that plant name on there. Next, we're going to talk about filling the tray. And after I've just scared you with that inconsistency story, I am sure you are going to fill your trays level. But there are a couple of other things that you want to keep in mind when you are filling your trays. I keep all of my media in trash cans, actually, because it's a great way to keep moisture locked in there, especially if you have open bags. So, first thing you're going to notice is that I have this little trash bag laying down underneath here. And that's because I don't like to waste media at all, especially when it is so expensive these days. And this is a perfect example of how you as a home gardener can actually have a process similar to what I do. For most greenhouse standards, it's a little bit hick, but when you're a business startup, alas, you gotta make do. So, I am going to use my trusty scoop, and I'm gonna mix up this media here. And what I want you to notice, first of all, is how moist this is. It's clumpable, so you know that it's got some water retention in it. And I am literally making sure that most of the, at least the larger clumps, are broken down in the media. So I'm kind of shaking it loose so I can see exactly what's going on in the soil. There's no huge pieces of bark, I don't know, that got in there. You have no clumps, because clumps in essence are compacted soil, and that creates an inconsistency. Those clumps are hard for seedlings to tap their roots into. So it's good to break down as many of those as you can as you go. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Now I'm using my hand here. I'm not compacting, I'm actually leveling. But an even more standard tool to use for leveling is your scoop. You can use the side of your scoop and fill. The other thing you just saw me do was tap the soil in a little bit. It's not good to do too much tapping, because that can take pore space out of the soil, but a little bit is good, because you are inevitably gonna move these trays, and as you move the trays, they're gonna be tapped around, and you are gonna have soil that compacts down in there. And you wanna make sure you get these as level and as consistently filled as possible. So a little tapping don't hurt nobody. So you can see I'm getting it filled all the way to the edges. The edges are oftentimes where those partially filled cells happen. So that's why the trash bag is there, is to catch excess. Don't be afraid to spill, you know, this is a dirty process. Nobody gardens because it's clean. Let's just get that out of the way. All right. So I am pretty happy with this. You can see that I've got a pretty level situation. Now, it doesn't hurt anybody if you go back and add a little bit more soil in spots. It's always about making it as consistent as possible. The next step after this is to go ahead and water in the tray, water in the soil that is there, because when you first put your seed into the cell, it is important that it's moist, because the first step of germination is water imbibition into the seed coat. So it's really good to have your cells saturated with water to start with. It's a good first step in perfecting that process. And it's ready for the next one. So when you are watering in your tray, there are a couple things to keep in mind when you are perfecting this part of the process. First of all, as discussed earlier in an earlier session, droplet size matters a lot when you are working with small seedlings. When you use a watering can, it has a super huge droplet size, and that's a lot of weight, water weight and gravity to come down on really fine seed starting soil and little seeds. That droplet size can actually displace soil out of the tray. It can also displace seed into other parts of the tray or even onto the ground, and we wouldn't want to waste that. Right off the bat, that would decrease your germination rate. So we use droplet sizes that are nice and small and soft and lightweight. So that is where your handy dandy misting bottle comes in, or if you're so lucky to have a hose, get a mist nozzle. You can order these off Amazon actually, and you can get different mist sizes, and they're very handy for large scale use. They make this part of the process go a lot faster. Now, I watered in my flats with this type of mist bottle for a good at least 5 years before I was able to use a mist nozzle in college. I mean, so it's doable, and especially on a smaller scale. But basically you just keep at it with your mister and keep pumping and get some really good biceps working. And you can feel if you are to the point of saturation by weight. So you kind of have an idea of what the tray felt like before you started watering it. It felt pretty light. So you want to make sure that tray feels pretty heavy. That means that there's water being retained in that germination seed starting mix, and you know that it's got water in there, and you are ready to head on to the next step. Now, I forgot to mention something important when you are watering in your media. There is no added nutrients in that water, and that's because in each individual seed, it has stored in it a little bit of a snack for that embryo. When it first starts to germinate, it has plenty of nutrients, just the right amount for it to tap that first radicle and open those cotyledons. It is only after seeds germinate that you need to start adding in small amounts of nutrients, and we're going to talk about that in the next session. So the next step in the process is dibbling, and it's a really cute word. It sounds akin to dimple, which makes a little bit of sense because you're basically creating dimples in the soil, but you are using a tool that has a point, so you can actually use a screwdriver, a stick, a pencil, any of those kind of things work. And you're going to take that tool and you are going to create little dimples, if you will, or dibbles in the soil, where you are going, basically you're creating a bullseye for when you're seeding. You're creating a target to aim for. You're not going very deep. I'm talking like a 1/4 inch at most. And you're just making a little swirly, and oftentimes if you hit a clump, you can kind of break it apart with the point of it. The depth of the dibble is very important, and there's a couple reasons why. First of all, if you dibble too deeply, and when you plant the seed, it drops almost to the bottom of the cell, or at least halfway down in the cell, it can be too deep and the seed will never germinate, either because it's not exposed to enough light, if it requires light to germinate, or if it's just so small and it's covered by so much soil that it just is not able to reach the surface before it damps off or rots out. So it's really important that you're dibbling at most a 1/4 inch deep for some of these seeds that are smaller. Now, if you are planting any kind of larger seed that is very easy to see, like a squash of some sort or a melon, those you can dibble a little bit more deeply. The rule of thumb is to plant seeds 2 to 3 times their depth. Now, if you have a seed that requires light to germinate, you might consider doing away with the dibble altogether, because planting those seeds by just popping them on the surface of the soil is an excellent way to make sure that they are exposed to enough light to germinate. Food for thought. After you have finished dibbling your tray and it looks nice and consistent, a row of dots, then it's time to pull out the seeds. And this is where my next, I don't know if you want to call it a tool, it is a tool because it's used purposefully for me. I get out either a jar or a little Pyrex dish, a little glass dish like this, or a plastic small Tupperware container is a little bit nicer. If you've got a concrete floor, I have broken some glass in here before by not having coordinated hands at all. But having these is really nice so that you can put your seed packet, your seeds directly in there. You can see exactly what you're working with as far as size goes. And if you pour seeds into your hand and you seed out of your hand tends to sweat, I find. And that sweat, we've talked about water triggering germination. And if you've poured more seeds into your hand than you plan on actually using, then those seeds can go bad if you get them wet, and that can ruin them. So you don't want to expose seeds to water. You can keep them in a nice dry container while you're seeding. And it helps you too not to drop seeds. It's just a nicer way to perfect the process. So I'm just gonna put my seeds in this container here. These are bigger seeds, so I'm using the larger container. And I'm just going to pop these in the dibble spots in their holes. And as I go, I might miss the target, and that's where the dibbler comes back in handy, and you can use it to kind of scoop those seeds in, or if you accidentally put 2 in one cell and you don't mean to, then you can move that to another side. The other thing, when we're talking about planting, sometimes it's nice to have multiple seeds sown per cell, especially if you're growing something like an herb like chives or parsley where you want it to be very clumpy, you've got a lot of starts in one unit. Another reason to put more than 1 seed per cell is if you want to have really good looking trays for germination. You can always go back later, and if 2 germinate in 1 cell, you can thin them out and remove those extra seedlings. Now, that's a more expensive way to do it and a little bit more wasteful, but if you know you're dealing with a species, a plant that is very difficult for you to germinate, then it might be good to increase your chances ×2 by putting two seeds per cell, or even ×3 by putting 3 seeds per cell. That's just another little hack that you can use to make sure you've got full trays. After you have planted your seeds in the tray, it's time to either cover or not to cover if your seeds require light to germinate. So the way you do that is put a really thin layer. Since you've already dibbled and dropped those seeds into a certain depth, that dibble will close when you water this in. And so you don't really have to cover them that much. Now, if it's dark germ, I encourage you to have a pretty thick layer on there. But if it's light germ, or if there's some light required to germinate, I use vermiculite to cover the surface. And I'll show you an up close of what this looks like. But I have this in a jar, and this looks really hick, but this is another tool I use. This is a jar that I've literally taken a screwdriver. I did not use my dibbler because that would really ruin my dibbler. And I poked holes in the top for this coarse vermiculite, and I use it like a shaker. And I literally go over the top and I put a light dusting of vermiculite over the top. Particularly for marigolds, this is a great pro tip. Vermiculite is a great cover for marigolds. So after you have covered your seeds, you have chosen to cover or not to cover, depending on if they need light to germinate. Then you go ahead and water them in so that you settle that surface media or settle the seeds that you've just planted. And that's where these domes come in nice and handy. And you can just pop those over the top. I have a half tray here, so it doesn't work quite as well. But those domes, not only do they let the light in if it's necessary, but they also keep that humidity trapped in there and even a little bit of warmth if there's warmth generated from the soil when it heats up during the day. So it's important to add those covers if you've got them. Now, if you need dark germ, don't forget a little hack. You can use the black trash bag and just take that and literally kind of wrap it over the top to make sure that there's no light particles getting into that seed. Last, now that we have completed the process of planting our seeds, I wanted to talk to you about the stages of germination a little bit, because this is really important for you to understand going into the next session, the last session, where I talk to you all about taking data down and making sure that you have information for future years. But germination, there is a process. So we start with water imbibition into the seed coat. That is something we've already discussed. And after that water seeps into that seed coat, there is a process where hormones and nutrients are unlocked, and the first root, the radicle, is triggered to tap out of the seed. And then the first shoot, the hypocotyl, that comes out and it grows upward out of the soil. Well, what you'll notice if you pay close attention to your seeds as they germinate over the next several days, probably 6 to 8 days, depending on what you've planted, you will notice that there is a little hook that comes up first. There's a little loop that comes out of the soil. It's not like there's just a straight sprout that comes out. That hook is the hypocotyl just emerging out of the seed itself, out of the embryo. And that is called hook stage in germination terms in the industry. And so you're gonna have hook stage, and then eventually that will pop right up and you'll see these, what we call cotyledons, the seed leaves. And the seed leaves eventually will pop open and they'll expand. And then you've got your full expansion. And then you will have your primary leaves, the first true leaves, and they will look like young, immature leaves of the plant that you've planted. So the first true leaves will look like tomato leaves if you planted a tomato, and it'll look like peppers. They might not look exactly like it because they're immature, but they're the first true leaves. Then you'll have secondary leaves and tertiary leaves and so on and so forth, and you're into young plant production. But germination occurs and you've got this kind of hook stage, and that's when you want to pop this dome off. You want to make sure that they have good quality lighting, because that is the point where you want to keep that hypocotyl or that shoot as short in length as possible so you don't end up with tipsy, leggy, soft growth. So that is the stage when it's important to start increasing light levels and start allowing some dry down cycles to occur. And we're going to talk more about this in the next video, but I wanted to explain to you the stages of germination in my own words so that you know what to expect over the next several days after you've planted your seeds. Now that I've done that, in your resource guide, I have created a little stages of germination illustration so that you can see what that looks like, what I just described. So that is all I have for this session. Like I mentioned, the next session is our last session. It will be the best session because I am going to talk a little bit more about the growing on side of your seedling growth development. And I think that you'll find it very interesting, and a lot of grower secrets will be shared. So tune in to the next session.